There is no Bronze Age without Cyprus. Bronze is copper and tin fused together, and for most of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, an enormous share of that copper came from one island. Every sword, every chariot fitting, every temple door hinge from Egypt to the Aegean likely passed through Cypriot hands before it ever became a weapon or a tool. So when the Bronze Age ended, the obvious assumption is that the island supplying its most critical raw material must have been destroyed, right along with everyone else. It was. And then, almost impossibly, it wasn't. Ancient sources call the island Alashiya, and for most of the 20th century, scholars weren't even certain it was Cyprus at all. The name shows up constantly in late Bronze Age diplomacy, in Egypt's Amarna letters, in Hittite records, in the very Ugarit correspondence this series has already followed, always treated as a major, respected kingdom. But ancient geography rarely comes with a map attached, and for decades, Alashiya's exact location remained an educated guess rather than a confirmed fact. Some scholars argued for locations in Syria or Anatolia instead, based purely on the routes described in surviving trade texts, with no way to test those guesses against anything more solid than educated speculation. The proof, when it finally came, wasn't historical. It was chemical. In the early 2000s, a research team led by archaeologist Yuval Gorin ran petrographic analysis, essentially a detailed mineral fingerprint, on the clay used to write the Alashiya letters found in Egypt's royal archive. The clay's mineral composition matched almost exactly to soil from the Troodos foothills, a specific mountainous region on Cyprus rich in exactly the kind of copper ore the island was famous for exporting. The letters themselves, without meaning to, had been carrying physical proof of their own origin the entire time. That single piece of geological evidence finally nailed down what centuries of diplomatic correspondence had only implied. Alashiya wasn't just an important Bronze Age trading partner. It was Cyprus, and Cyprus sat directly at the center of the entire eastern Mediterranean supply chain for the metal that gave the era its name. The Amarna letters themselves give a surprisingly human picture of that trading relationship, well beyond simple shipping manifests. In one letter, the king of Alashiya apologizes to Egypt's pharaoh for a smaller-than-expected copper shipment, explaining that what he calls the hand of Nergal, a plague, had struck his land and killed a significant number of the workers responsible for producing it. Even Cyprus's copper economy, the backbone of the entire region's weapons and tools, could be disrupted by nothing more dramatic than an outbreak of disease among its own miners. The scale of that dependency is easier to grasp through one specific shipwreck. Around 1300 BCE, a merchant vessel sank off the coast of southern Turkey near Uluburun, carrying roughly 10 tons of copper oxide ingots, alongside tin, glass, ivory, and luxury goods from at least 7 different regions. Analysis of those copper ingots points strongly toward Cypriot sources. One single ship, sunk by accident, was quietly carrying enough raw copper to arm and equip a significant portion of a late Bronze Age army. The Uluburun wreck also shows just how interconnected this system had become by the time it collapsed. Alongside the Cypriot copper, divers recovered tin, likely sourced from as far away as Central Asia, ebony from Africa, amber from the Baltic, and pottery from Cyprus, the Levant, and Mycenaean Greece, all loaded onto a single vessel bound for a single destination. A trade network built on that many simultaneous, distant links doesn't just need each individual partner to stay peaceful. It needs almost the entire chain to hold at once. Take that kind of supply chain and imagine it running constantly, for centuries, connecting Cyprus to Egypt, to the Levant, to the Aegean, to Anatolia, all of it dependent on stable harbors, trained metalworkers, and functioning long-distance shipping routes that assumed a relatively peaceful Mediterranean. Around 1200 BCE, that assumption stopped being true. Cyprus's major trading centers, including the copper processing city of Enkomi and the harbor city of Kishin, both show violent destruction layers dating to roughly this period. burned and damaged in a way consistent with the wider wave of destruction hitting Ugarit, the Hittite world, and the Aegean palaces around the exact same decades. So far, that sounds like exactly the story you'd expect. The island supplying the empire's most vital resource gets swept up in the same catastrophe as everyone it was supplying. Cyprus takes its place on the long list of late Bronze Age casualties. Except that's not where Cyprus's story actually ends. Unlike Ugarit, which was destroyed and simply never rebuilt, Enkomi and Kishan were both reoccupied and rebuilt within a relatively short span after their destruction. And the architecture that rose from those ashes doesn't look like a simple continuation of what came before. Excavators found new construction using the Megaron-style building plan, a distinctive rectangular hall layout closely associated with Mycenaean Greek architecture, alongside pottery styles that shifted sharply toward Asian forms and decoration. That combination points towards something more specific than random resettlement. It suggests that people connected to the collapsing Mycenaean world, the same world whose palaces we've already seen burning and whose writing system we've already seen disappearing entirely, were arriving on Cyprus in significant enough numbers to visibly reshape how its rebuilt cities looked and functioned. This is also where Cyprus's story quietly connects to a question this series has already asked and left unresolved. Several of the names Egypt recorded among the so-called Sea Peoples, groups whose own islands were described as already scattered before they ever reached Egyptian shores, have never been confidently placed on a map. Cyprus's sudden influx of Aegean-style architecture and pottery doesn't prove any specific named group ended up there. It does show that Cyprus was, at minimum, one real, physical destination, absorbing at least some share of the same wave of displaced Aegean populations that Egypt was busy fighting off entirely. Cyprus, in other words, may have absorbed some of the very displacement crisis that helped end the Bronze Age everywhere else, and instead of collapsing under it the way Ugarit did, it seems to have used that displaced population to rebuild. Here's the uncomfortable question underneath that pattern. What if surviving the late Bronze Age collapse had less to do with military strength or political stability, and more to do with simply being a place worth rebuilding? Cyprus's copper wasn't a liability that made it a target. It may have been exactly the resource that gave rebuilding communities, however displaced or disrupted, a genuine economic reason to stay and restart production rather than scatter and disappear the way populations did elsewhere. That economic logic gets a longer echo than almost anywhere else in this series. Cyprus's material culture transitions relatively smoothly from this rebuilt late Bronze Age phase into what archaeologists call the Cypro-geometric period, the island's own version of the early Iron Age, without the centuries-long total cultural blackout Greece experienced on the mainland. The island that fed the Bronze Age world's weapons industry ended up being one of the few places in the region with something close to real continuity on the other side of the collapse. That continuity matters even more once you compare it directly to what happened on the Greek mainland during those same centuries. While Cyprus kept working mines, functioning harbors, and a continuous material record, mainland Greece spent roughly 400 years without a single confirmed trace of writing anywhere in the archaeological record. An entire population that had lost a skill its own ancestors once used every day. Cyprus, sitting just off that same collapsing world, never went dark in anything close to the same way. None of this means Cyprus escaped the crisis lightly. The destruction at Enkomi and Kishan was real, violent, and consistent with a wider regional catastrophe, not a minor disruption. What makes Cyprus genuinely unusual isn't that it avoided the disaster. It's that it absorbed the disaster's refugees and rebuilt around them, instead of being permanently emptied by it the way Ugarit was, just a short sail away across the same burning Mediterranean. Kishan in particular shows this pattern in its own layered construction. Excavators found later late Bronze Age building phases raised directly on top of earlier destruction debris, using an ashlar masonry technique, large, precisely cut stone blocks that represents a genuine investment of skilled labor and resources rather than a quick, temporary patch job. Whoever rebuilt Kachin wasn't just camping in the ruins. They were planning to stay. We still don't know exactly how many of Cyprus's new arrivals came willingly, as organized settlers seeking a fresh start, versus how many were refugees with nowhere else left to go, washing up on the one island in the region that still had working mines and functioning trade infrastructure worth salvaging. The archaeology shows the result. It doesn't show the individual decisions or the individual desperation behind it. It's also worth being honest that not every part of Cyprus tells the same recovery story equally well. Some sites show a clearer, faster rebuilding pattern than others, and the exact timeline connecting each destruction layer to its corresponding reconstruction phase is still actively debated among excavators working different parts of the island. Cyprus's survival wasn't a single clean island-wide event. It was a patchwork of local outcomes that, taken together, still adds up to something dramatically different from what happened at Ugarit. What survives from Cyprus isn't a burned archive, or an unsent letter, or a genetic signature buried in an infant's bones. It's a rebuilt skyline, an island that supplied an entire civilization's weapons, watched that civilization collapse city by city around it, and then, instead of following everyone else into silence, quietly kept forging bronze while an entire era ended everywhere else it had ever shipped that metal to. No pharaoh carved that survival into a temple wall to boast about it. No scribe wrote a triumphant letter announcing the island had made it through. The proof is simply still standing, layer upon layer, in the rebuilt stone of Enkomi and Kishon, exactly where the fire once tried to end it.